Welcome to MySecurity TV and our Tech and Sec Weekly. My name is Chris Cubbage. I'm the editor with MySecurity Media, and we record these on Fridays and Tuesdays. And today we're going to be joined by Zack Cooper, Senior Fellow with the American Enterprise Institute. We're going to be discussing the US Indo-Pacific strategy. Let me just check my streams. We should be live, I hope. And everything looks like okay. I can see an image at least. And if you do happen to be watching, we should be streaming live on LinkedIn, Facebook, and on YouTube. So please press like or share and let us know where you are listening from ever you are in the world. Let me just get these slides going and just want to make sure that this is streaming, and looks like I'm blocked in somewhere. But otherwise, I'll keep going for now because we are recording. We do cover on aerospace and space, defence and national security, cybersecurity and critical technology, and cities and infrastructure. We'll go for at least 40 to 45 minutes, particularly on this topic. And as I mentioned, this is being recorded in a live stream. So let us know if you are watching. And we do have chat as well. So if you happen to want to comment or ask a particular question of Zack, please don't hesitate. This follows on. It's almost like a part two. Last week, we had Professor John Blaxland from the Australian National University with Strategic and Defence Studies, looking at the same topic and the US release of their strategic framework for the Indo-Pacific. And we were also joined by X-Tech Limited, and their deal with Milram Robotics is within that interview as well. So it does sort of follow on, and it does also follow on a number of other episodes that we've done on the Indo-Pacific as well. And then also last Friday, we were joined by John Carabin, Director for Cybersecurity with NTT Australia, and also Anthony Spiteri, the Senior Global Technologist with Veeam, looking at, there was a very much on cybersecurity issues and sort of digital forensics, incident response. And we also looked at DNA, the advanced storage technologies, and we ended up looking at cybersecurity and the importance of storage. So that is also available as a podcast on the Cybersecurity Weekly podcast. Next Tuesday, we're going to be looking at semiconductors, and this follows a study from the University of Sydney. We'll be joined by Professor James Rabal, looking at the capabilities, opportunities, and challenges in the global supply chain. And then also on that episode, we're going to be joined by Andrew Wilson of Senatus. Senatus is a ASX-listed company, and a couple of months ago or weeks, I can't remember when I saw it, but they've announced their first quantum-resistant network encryption capability, and having a look at Senatus, very much into the encryption space. So looking forward to that also. And then just lined up yesterday, next Friday, we get our Friday morning session will be focused on the Cybersecurity Task Force recommendations here in New South Wales with Dr. Jed Horner from Standards Australia. And this follows on a webinar that we ran last July in 2020 as the task force was set up, and we were joined by the Minister for New South Wales Services at the time as well. So it's great to see the outcomes from that particular session. And then also Data 61 and Dr. Sushmita Ruj, hopefully I'm saying her name correctly, Senior Research Scientist with Data 61, and they've just released an AI-driven privacy tool. I think if you look at PIF and Data 61, you'll start to see that. So looking forward to next Friday's session as well. And I've just recorded some episodes with Seagate and looking at their Skyhawk surveillance hard drives, and particularly looking at advanced video surveillance and video analytics. So again, an interesting one. And thank you to the user. I can't see who your name is, but whoop, whoop. So we've got someone actually listening. Thank you very much. So that's about it from us. We've got a good couple of sessions coming up also next week. And I've been looking forward to Zack. He was supposed to join us potentially with John Blaxland, but being that time zone, so let me bring Zack on. Zack, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. And sorry I missed you last week, but it's great to talk to you now.
No, we've got you all to ourselves now for the full session. And I think it's also a good thing. I'm sure having John and yourself on, we would have been better off having you singularly anyway. Zack, I think maybe for the audience, introduce yourself in terms of your role, Senior Research Fellow, but you've got quite a interesting background, and also in sort of defence and national security in the US. It's great to have a Washington perspective, a US perspective as well, and a little bit about the American Enterprise Institute as a think tank. And then we'll sort of dive into US strategy in the Indo-Pacific.
Absolutely. Well, first, again, Chris, thank you so much for having me. Why don't I start off with the American Enterprise Institute, where I work now. So the American Enterprise Institute is a public policy research organization, a think tank in Washington, traditionally a bit conservative leaning. But certainly we've had our share of Trump critics the last few years, of which I am certainly one. And I focus there mostly on Asian security issues. So usually I get to Australia once or twice a year. This is probably the longest I've gone without being in Australia in quite a while. It's unfortunate, and
Yep.
I'm a little pained watching all of my friends down there go act like life is normal while we here in the US are struggling.
But look, well, and on that, condolences again from Australia. It's not good news, and it's sad to see. But again, we feel very lucky here.
No, well, you should feel lucky, but it's also a bit of a product of not just good geography, I think, but good governance, which is something hopefully we'll be getting back to. So I focus mainly on Asian security issues. A lot of that obviously is how to deal with the rise of China, but my main focus is how to work with our allies and partners in the region, particularly Japan, Australia, Korea to some extent, and then Taiwan, Vietnam, Philippines, India as well. So that's where I spend most of my time. I also do a little bit of other stuff on the side. I do some teaching at Georgetown and Princeton, and then I co-direct something called the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which is located at the German Marshall Fund here in the United States. And then I also run a podcast called Net Assessment for War on the Rocks. So I'm busy, and hopefully my 1 and my 3-year-old are now falling asleep, so they will not create problems. But if they do, that is them wanting to say hello to all of you.
I can't think of the guy's name from the North Korean interview where the kid's running in the background. So
actually, he's somebody that a lot of us know in my world, of course, because he is a Korean security expert. But I think forever now he is only going to be known as BBC Dad.
That's the one. Well, look, you came across sort of my desk in terms of on the release of the strategy or the strategic framework from the US, and it was a sort of protected document released by the former administration. And sort of just briefly pre-interview, it was, I want to get your take on the circumstances around that being released and the intention of that, and then that'll lead us into sort of a key question on where the US sees itself and what it's likely to look like sort of moving on under a Biden administration. So maybe start with that framework and the purpose of it being released. As John pointed out last week, and we will refer back to John's interview because it does link back, but there wasn't anything really sort of groundbreaking in that. So, it's not like they really released anything sort of specific or top secret or that was surprising. But the fact that it should have been protected for 30 years under sort of the normal protocols says a lot, right?
Yeah, that's right. And, it's an interesting document for a lot of reasons. And I think John summarized a lot of these nicely. His other colleague at ANU, Rory Metcalf, of course, was one of the handful of people that got an early copy of the report. And I think he did a nice job explaining some of what's new in it. But what's sort of fascinating, as you said, is usually these documents are pretty closely held. There's some very serious restrictions on White House strategy documents in particular. And so all of those White House records, they actually aren't even available to the next administration when they come in. They all get packed up, filed away. I worked in the White House right before a transition, and I remember preparing for a lot of this. And so I think the Trump team felt that their China strategy was pretty good, and they wanted to get it out there and claim some credit for it. It is quite atypical to do that with a classified document. It's also a little surprising because if you think back to the summer, in May or early June, they had put out a China strategy. So it's not that there wasn't already a U.S. government strategy out there on China. They'd already put out an unclassified strategy that was longer and more detailed in some senses. And yet they basically put that out. They put out another China document from the State Department in the late fall, which was a very long analysis. And then, of course, they added this relatively short memo just before the end of the administration. So they put a lot of paperwork out there. I'm not quite sure what the audience was for this, though.
And also the timing, like literally a week or so out from sort of the changeover. Was there anything in there that really does sort of justify it being released, or was it just an opportunity to have one more crack at it? As you say, there was a lot of discussions, all the statements from Pompeo as well in his speech sort of series as well. There was no real secrets in there. And I suppose you started off, maybe the better question would be, the strategy aims to maintain US strategic primacy in the Indo-Pacific. And as I started off with John, is primacy for the US realistic in the Indo-Pacific or sensible? Maybe just sort of touch on that and discuss that part.
Yeah, I think that's the core question for the strategy. And I know the authors of the strategy, so I was having a bit of a debate with them after it came out. I'm not a fan of the argument that the United States should seek primacy globally. I'm not even sure it's possible to seek primacy in Asia at this point. But what's really interesting about the document is it is an effort to redefine primacy. I'm not sure it works. But the authors explained to me that if you look at the document, it sets 3 military objectives. So outside the first island chain, so the island chain, of course, connecting Japan down to Taiwan to the Philippines and so forth, the objective is for the United States to have control of those maritime zones. Along the first island chain, it's for the U.S. to basically continue to be able to support and defend those allies and partners that we have. And then within the first island chain, so in the East China Sea and the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, the strategy only aims for denial. So it aims to prevent China from having control itself. Now, I think if you were to ask a bunch of academics like me, we would say that's not primacy, right? Primacy means you get to go where you want, when you want. It doesn't mean that other countries can stop you from doing that. And so what's interesting in my mind about the document is it's saying that the US should have primacy. It's using that term. But if you actually look at the details, it doesn't sound like anything I think of as primacy. It's actually a much more restricted concept geographically within that first island chain. And I actually think that might be possible. So in some senses, I think there's a little bit of a language issue here. And I think the authors were hoping to use this document to redefine the concept of primacy. I think that would require a longer, bigger argument, and maybe that's coming at some point soon. But that's one of the real tensions in the document itself.
Look, it's a good segue. And for the audience listening, I'll put a link to Zack's sort of Twitter thread that you sort of break down, because we could get lost in analysing that strategic framework when really it's almost old news now that we've got a new administration. So I want to at least cover what you anticipate Biden's strategy to be, if different. And the other one is it's a good segue. You mentioned sort of terminology and the language, and it comes back to an article you wrote, Bad Idea, Great Power Competition Terminology. What should be the language around here between US and China? And we're getting sort of daily sort of influence here in Australia. There's a bit of New Zealand and Australia sort of tit for tat going on as well. And language is so important. It can be misconstrued or meant and sort of taken for granted, I think, in a lot of the ways. So maybe discuss the great power competition and then the language around what we should be sort of settling on as sort of key terms?
Yeah, it's such an important issue. So the United States adopted this great power competition language really about 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. And the idea was that the Pentagon had to focus not on counterterrorism and counterinsurgency operations, but on high-end threats. And the Pentagon would often name Russia and China as the great powers that we're competing with. Now, that made some sense if you are a Pentagon person. I started my career there, so I get the logic of this. The problem is when you take that language and you apply it in Asia, I just don't think it works. Because what we're actually competing over, what the US and China are competing over, is the alignment decisions of third parties, mainly states in Asia. And when you go telling allies and partners that actually this is a great power competition, you're telling them that they're not really part of it. And actually, I think that's a big mistake. I don't think the power competition is actually even the most important part of this. I think it's a competition over how people think they should be governed and how the international order should be governed. And on that, that's not about power. That's actually as much about values as anything. And I think this is where the US has hurt itself a bit. If we want Australia, New Zealand, Japan, go on down the list, right? Korea, Taiwan, Southeast Asians, India, to get on board with a strategy that takes a somewhat harder line against China, why would they do it if this is just about whether the US continues to be the dominant power in Asia? That doesn't sound particularly attractive to a lot of those countries. Now, if this is about what are the rules of the road and how do countries act and operate, is it fair for China to be using all kinds of asymmetric economic coercive tools against Australia and others? That, I think, is a much different story. So my view is this great power competition language, it made sense inside the Pentagon, but we never should have used it outside. We should have been talking about what our actual core values are that we need to work together on. The reality, of course, is that was pretty hard for the Trump administration to do because the president didn't really like talking about values. And so they had to fall back into this talk about power.
And do you see Biden's administration taking on a little bit more of that on values?
I do. And I'm on record on this, as some folks may know. So I co-authored a piece in December with a woman named Laura Rosenberger, who's just taken over as the lead for China at the White House. The title of the piece was about the importance of values and reinserting values into our strategies. So I think this is a pretty obvious argument that, is something the Biden team should be doing. I think they're likely to embrace that effort. And it's not American values, right? It's shared values. In fact, the place I really got to know Laura was in Canberra. And so, and the reason we were both in Canberra was to talk about what the US and Australia should be doing to work together to deal with the China challenge. And so I think what we need to be doing as the United States is working with our allies and partners to actually think through what are the core values that we believe in, that we need to be standing up for, and let's do that. And I think the positive things that we've seen already out of the Biden team are that they're willing to take some shots on this. I think. Yeah, go ahead.
In terms of values, is it democratic values versus communism and the sort of different government approaches and the views of the world? Because China obviously does not see that at all. They think that their rule of government is the right rule of government.
So I think that's one of the 4 sets of values that are critical. So one of these values exactly is about governance, right? And we believe that people should choose their leaders, and the Chinese Communist Party basically does not. I think we've got the better argument, but I don't think that's the only argument about values that we should be having. So let me give you the 3 others. One is on security, right? I think we should be having a rules-based order, right? Not a power-based order. And Xi Jinping just went to Davos and talked a whole lot about how big power shouldn't abuse their power. I mean, I'm watching what's going on in Australia right now, and it certainly doesn't seem like he's following that guidance. So I think on the security side, we have core values about how security should be pursued, right? And it's not through coercion, not through use of force. And I don't think the Chinese have followed a lot of those rules the last few years. On the economic side, I also don't think the Chinese have been following some core rules that we believe in, right? Not just about economic coercion, but also about unfair market restrictions, about state subsidies, intellectual property theft. There's a whole series of issues where not just the US and Australia, but the G7 as well, have just fundamentally different views and values, in fact, about how we think economic interaction should function. And then last, I think there's a technology part. And this technology part, as you know very well, is underlined by values also, right? If the Chinese and the Russians get their way, they will have sovereign internets effectively, right? And I think that is a direct threat, not to the US, but to democracies around the world, because we rely on free and open and trusted information. So in all of these areas, I think we've got to double down on our values. And it doesn't mean only working with democracies, right? There are a lot of countries that are not democratic, but actually share our values on how security should operate. You know, Vietnam is a perfect example. There are a lot of countries that share our views on economics, even if they don't share them on broader governance issues. And so I think the values have to be the core in each of these silos, each of these issue areas.
Well, they're all very interdependent as well, and certainly security and technology are key ones. They're particularly from our Tech and Sec Weekly, we do link the two. And then John also talked a lot about the trade and also opportunities there. Where maybe let's touch on security and technology. And you've just written a book. It just hasn't been released yet, but you looked at sort of the future predictions of US, China, and military-wise. And I think that's where the security and technology aspects really come to the forefront of US is obviously leading militarily, but China is looking to catch up. And you only need one sort of sudden advancement in a technology. We're seeing a lot in space, AI, also, swarm robotics. It's almost endless. You need a potential game changer there. Where did that book take you, and maybe how that's structured? Because that's kind of how I think sometimes. I have to switch my brain off when you start to predict and where this is all sort of moving on to.
Yeah, well, you'll have to stop me here because it's a long book.
Okay.
It's a long slog, so I'll give you the short version. I think if you zoom out and try and think about what has happened over the last 30 years in terms of the US-China military competition, there are two central dynamics. One is that the United States has become weaker in relative terms compared to China. That's not going to come as a surprise to anyone. The second factor is that China has very rapidly built an anti-access area denial capability, which is calling into question the American ability to project power in Asia. Those are two related but slightly different trends. Now, if you continue them, you could imagine that 10 years down the line, it might be very difficult or almost impossible for the US to use, say, aircraft carrier strike groups, or even forward bases in the region, especially if they're close in along the first island chain or even maybe out to Guam, to project power in ways that would deter or defend against attacks from China. That is a world that, in my view, we have to stop from happening. It's a world in which China could break US alliances and could fundamentally change the status quo, not just on Taiwan, but potentially on other issues as well. The good news here, and I think we very often overlook this, is that actually those two trends are working for us, not against us. So the United States may be in relative decline, at least at the moment. But if you think about what's been going on in the competition, the price of projecting power has risen. It's become more and more difficult. But the US actually doesn't have to project power into East Asia. It has to be able to stop China from projecting power itself. Because for China to accomplish its goals, like, say, physically invading and taking and holding Taiwan, it has to project power over long distances, over water, through amphibious invasions, which is really tough. And so the fact is that the technology revolution that's been ongoing, China has taken the first step, but it's possible, I think, for the US to now turn this back on China. China is already starting to build its own power projection capabilities. It's got 3 aircraft carriers. It's building more. It's building lots of amphibious ships. It's actually doing exactly what the United States typically does, but China's shown us that there's a strategy that can beat that power projection. And so a lot of the book is about sort of reversing this recent trend and making sure that we're on the right side of the cost imposing strategy, right? That when we buy one more missile, it has a asymmetric effect because it's going to be really hard for Beijing to actually build enough ships to be able to protect against those missiles, and they're going to be really costly. And so I think the question here for the US is whether we can reverse this debate and start building our own anti-access capabilities along with allies and partners, particularly in the first island chain, to protect them in the case of an armed attack by China.
How do you think that views from China's perspective as well on sort of that counter strategy, as you've just outlined there? They obviously have that sort of nationalist approach that they want to project that power, and that gives them sort of that internal power as well. It does sort of bring us to the Taiwan question on the timing. Did you have any sort of answers or predictions in that thought, okay, timing becomes very critical in this as well, if there's such expense in building that military capability, and that's out to 2035, their strategy goes for. Anything around sort of timing or key timing in this, and sort of with a view of Taiwan?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just had a testimony this morning on this fact, and so let me make an argument to you, and we'll see if you buy it. The argument is that I think actually both the United States and China believe at the moment that time is on their side, which is pretty atypical, right? Usually if you think about two countries, you think that trends are advantaging one or the other. And you might expect them both to believe that trends are advantaging the same one, right? But actually, if you talk to Chinese leaders and officials and experts, you'll often hear them say things like what Xi Jinping said just a few months ago, that momentum is on China's side, right? And I think the argument is if China can just get through this pretty difficult period right now, it will have lots of opportunities 5-10 years down the line, including potentially on Taiwan, to change the status quo. On the other hand, listen to Joe Biden. Joe Biden said over the summer, right, that I think he said, come on, China, they're not competition for us, right? And the argument is sort of, yeah, they've started the competition first, but that the underlying elements that support American power are much more enduring than those that support the Chinese Communist Party. So what's fascinating to me is here you have Xi Jinping, you have Joe Biden, both arguing that, there may be this dicey period in the next couple of years, 5 years, who knows, but that after that, the sources of their own power are going to strengthen. The good thing about this is that it sort of suggests that there's not reason for either side to launch a first strike because they're both confident that in the long term they're going to win. The bad news is that at some point, one of them is going to realize that they're wrong. And at the moment that they realize they're wrong, they're going to have a huge incentive to push very quickly before time is on the other side. And so I think we're at this risky moment where the US has to do a lot fast to reinforce the military balance across the Taiwan Strait, because we don't have any idea when those views of timing could change, right? Could be this year, it could be 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now, who knows? So we've got to do two things. One is start making the shift that I talked about earlier. So if that were me, I would be building a huge number of anti-ship cruise missiles, a huge number of sea mines, many more undersea submersibles, whether manned or unmanned, to make the sea denial challenge for China in the Taiwan Strait much more difficult in the short term. And then in the long term, there are real questions about whether the US needs to invest in a whole different set of capabilities, things like directed energy to try and shoot down incoming missiles that might be able to buy back a little bit of power projection capability. So unfortunately, we can't make one bet on the timing issue, right? We can't bet that China can only deal with Taiwan in the next 5 years, and we can't bet that it will only choose to do that 15 years from now. We've got to build a force that can do both. And I think right now we're kind of stuck in the middle, unsure of which direction we should be going.
And how does the US sort of engage with its allies here in the region as well? And what does that mean for the Indo-Pacific, particularly ASEAN is another area, and you talked about that first island strategy that leaves that sort of the dotted line within the South China Sea, you know, unprotected. Malaysia, Philippines, all of them have interests in that area. Vietnam, where does that leave them on the inside there, and how does the US engage with them on that? So regardless of what you've just highlighted, and it does sound like we move into then an arms race, so to speak, and yep. Which is, you know, really, have we ever left one? It is sort of perpetual in a way. How does that impact on the region, really? Does that mean sort of the Five Eyes and the ASEAN sort of, and the Quad is sort of maybe the outcome of that type of thinking as well? And maybe is the Quad something that will sort of grow exponentially during that period too?
So for me, yeah, this means that what we need our allies to do is stop focusing quite so much on power projection, especially outside the regions, but even sometimes inside it, and start focusing more themselves on these anti-access capabilities, both the sensors to be able to pick up the targets, but also the shooters to be able to deal with them. And frankly, the only country that's taken that particularly seriously over the last year is Australia. Right. So I think the strategic update was exactly right. And let's be clear, part of that update was moving away from some directions that the US has been pushing Australia for years, right? The US doesn't really need Australia to have a handful more short-range tactical fighter jets. We don't need Australia to do all that it's been doing in the Middle East, in my view. What we need Australia to be able to do is watch its maritime and air approaches and deny them to Chinese forces if they were trying to come through, particularly, you know, Sunda, Lombok, the Indonesian archipelago. Now, the kinds of capabilities Australia is starting to buy and invest in, those are exactly the things that will do that effectively at range, right? And so I think long-range strike capabilities and sensor capabilities are exactly the kinds of niche capabilities that we need Australia and others to produce. Now, the problem is that outside of Australia and Japan, there aren't really a lot of countries that are doing this to a great extent. Taiwan has some of these capabilities, but it has also spent a large amount of money on some capabilities that really don't help very much, on tactical fighter aircraft that are going to really struggle to get through the first hour of the conflict, if there is one with China, on surface ships, which are going to have the same problem, right? So in this new world, if you're inside that threat bubble, anything that you can see, you can shoot. Mm-hmm. And that means if you're, you know, aircraft on the ground, if you're a surface ship and you're close to China, you're going to be in big trouble. And it's one thing to be Australia and be far away and be able to fly in from, you know, 3,000 miles away. It's another thing to be 100 miles away, like Taiwan. If you're 100 miles away, you have to be working on submarines potentially, but they can't be expensive. And unfortunately, Taiwan's built or it's tried to build a small number of expensive submarines. The only other country that's really playing in this area is Japan, and Japan's doing a lot. But again, we've put a lot of time and effort into Japan building up its power projection capabilities. But increasingly, what we need them to build are things like land-based missiles. And those aren't always the sexy platforms that military officers are extremely excited about purchasing and operating, but they're probably the ones that would be the most useful in a conflict.
And where does India sit in all of that too? Because it's a critical factor.
Yeah. So I think India is important, but I'll say my expectation is if there was a major conflict in East Asia with China, I'm not sure that the Indians would be playing a particularly active role. I think the Indians have a lot of challenges in the Indian Ocean, on the Sino-Indian border, and I think they would be quite distracted with those challenges. So don't get me wrong, India is incredibly important to U.S. strategy, right? If you're trying to balance China over the next couple of decades, India is a huge player in that. But if you're talking about a Taiwan Strait contingency and who's going to be there other than Taiwan and the US, I hope Japan would be there. I think there's an open discussion, which we should all be having, about whether Australia would be there. I don't think you'll get many others.
We're definitely starting to hear that conversation here in Australia now in terms of Taiwan, and almost sort of weekly, China is really poking them in terms of even into their airspace last week. What type of signal does that give to this discussion that we're having, and what is trying to say during that period? Are they just exercising and just testing their own systems? What type of strategic message are they saying? Everyone knows what they want. Taiwan is really stuck in the middle here. What's your view on those types of exercises? And we'll come back to the Quad on that too, because depending on what your answer is as well.
Yeah, look, we're, I think, just going to see this continuing level of tension rise in the Taiwan Strait. Xi Jinping has made very clear that he intends to make Taiwan a top priority of his. And, I would think before he leaves office that he wants to unify Taiwan with the mainland. I think we have to make sure that that is a choice that the people on Taiwan get to make themselves. And that they should have the ability to do so in without coercion, right? And so if it was me making this decision, I would say the U.S. has to have the deterrent capabilities and it has to demonstrate them to make sure that China understands that it can't forcibly insist that Taiwan join the mainland. But this is going to be a hard military problem. The U.S. needs its allies involved. And, I've been watching closely from afar, read Paul Dibb's piece just a few days ago, and, a couple of others, which I think are, important. Peter Jennings had one, I know, as well, about starting this debate about what would happen in the US-Australia alliance if there was a Taiwan contingency. I think it's a debate we should be having very actively. And let me say, not just among the expert community, right? And this is a critique of the United States too. If it's only the expert community that believes that we should intervene in a Taiwan contingency in either country, then you're going to be out of step with the public. And that will increase the risk that the Chinese believe that you won't actually intervene. So if we're serious about upholding Taiwan's freedoms, then we have to be serious about talking about that openly with our people. And that's going to be a difficult discussion. There are going to be a lot of people who think it's not worth the risk.
Well, I also say come into the timing of this, of where nations are right now with the pandemic and, the fatigue of crisis and conflict as well.
Yeah, that's right. It's a hard time to be asking countries to do more on security. It's going to be an issue here, right? We're going to have a bit of a debate over the defense budget. And as we have that debate, there'll be a lot of people reminding folks that the US will have spent something like $5-6 trillion on pandemic relief and response. And so spending another bit on defense is going to be pretty difficult. But I guess my bottom line is, if the region wants security, then it's going to have to start to pay for that security. And I think we've seen some countries step up, right? Look at what Australia has done recently. I know the Morrison government has its critics, but on the defense side, I think they've taken this incredibly seriously. Japan is stepping up and doing more, right? Vietnam is stepping up and doing more. So is India. So I think we're starting to see the beginnings of an awakening to the reality that the US just frankly can't do this on its own. It needs help. And I'm hopeful that having these more open and forthright discussions, we can actually lead to the kinds of cooperation that would get us towards the capabilities we need to demonstrate not just to China, but to friends in the region that the US and its allies have the capability to actually back up their words.
I hear a lot about, the US and allies. Where's China? They've got Pakistan, North Korea, potentially Iran, Russia. How do they see themselves as a collective, or should we be seeing them as a collective as well? This isn't just China.
I don't think so. Every time I meet with Chinese and talk about North Korea, they're quick to remind me that the only people that the North Koreans seem to like less than the South Koreans or the Americans are the Chinese.
Okay, well, that's good.
and so, if these are your allies, the North Koreans and the Russians, good luck. Which is not to say that we shouldn't worry about those alignments, right? We absolutely should. But it's to say that there are going to be a lot of fissures in those relationships, right? Do the Chinese think they can trust Vladimir Putin? I hope not. Do the Russians think that they can trust China to act on their behalf? I doubt that as well, because the only thing they really share is a dislike of the United States.
Yep.
Right? There's no core underlying logic. China isn't Marxist anymore, but it's definitely Leninist. I guess Putin shares a view of Leninism, but it's a different party. It's the party of Putin on one hand and the Communist Party on the other. Same thing in North Korea, right? So there's just not a lot that brings those countries together other than opposition to the US and some of its allies and partners. And look, that's enough to sort of lead to some limited cooperation at times. But it brings me back to the point that if you were, deciding which side of this you want to be on in sort of a Rawlsian sense, if you got to choose, do you want to be China with its allies or the US with its allies, you're going to choose the United States every day. But we have to actually make use of those alliances and build on them and respect them. And that's what I think we haven't done a particularly good job of the last few years.
And what about on the other side in terms of Eurasia and any issues or sort of opportunities there? Because it can get sort of distraction that sort of Taiwan is a real ignition point. But is there any other sort of key trends going on? And I am reading a little bit more about Eurasia in terms of what China is doing there with Europe.
Yeah, the Chinese are really making some inroads in Europe and not just Eastern Europe, right? You've I think watched some of the German debate about China over the last couple of weeks and months. Clearly there's a real desire to engage the Chinese economically, and to sometimes even sort of accept some of the activities that the Chinese are pursuing that are dangerous and destabilizing, as long as there's some economic benefit there. Of course, that's not just true of the Europeans. The US signed a phase 1 trade deal with China that kind of did the same thing. So in some senses, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. But I think at the end of the day, this is where we have to, this is why I think we have to get back to values. Mm-hmm. Right? The Europeans are not going to care that much about Taiwan. It's just way, way outside their main area of security that they're most worried about. What they should care a lot about are the core values that underlie the system we have. And I think reminding all of us of what our objectives are and the fact that we need to work together to accomplish them, that is going to be a critical task for the Biden team. I have to say, I'm pretty hopeful. If you look at the people that are coming in to work on Asia policy at the assistant secretary level and the deputy assistant secretary level and the special advisors, these are people who deeply believe in alliances and partnerships. They've spent a lot of time in Asia. A lot of them have more scholarly background, so I think they're more willing to sort of look at the tough data sometimes that says that the US isn't particularly popular at the moment and think about what to do about that. So, bottom line is, yeah, the Chinese have made some real progress in Europe. They're making a lot of progress in Central Asia and parts of Southeast Asia as well. But at the end of the day, if you look at the polling data, China is more present, but it's not more popular. In fact, often the more China is doing in an area, the less popular Beijing ends up being because of how they operate. And that is a real open door for all of us.
It does, that economic value, one of those four, the economics does sort of get a real play on all of that. And each nation has to have sort of that in mind for their own sort of national importance and national security as well internally. I suppose just to finish, just looking at the time now, what type of war gaming has been going? Can Taiwan, if it does come into a conflict, can it be isolated? And anything I've read and heard in that is it goes nuclear very quickly in terms of war gaming. How isolated could Taiwan be? And how much would that spread across into the region, and then also in potentially worst case?
Yeah, I think the big question here is you can think about two different kinds of scenarios, and they go in two different paths. So one is a coercive campaign against Taiwan using maybe air and missile attacks or a blockade, and the other is an outright invasion. Now, the outright invasion is in some ways the full frontal attack, right? It's the first thing we need to worry about rebuffing. The real challenge there is a timing question. Can China cross the Taiwan Strait, establish a foothold on Taiwan, and push out and take over the island before the US can flow forces back in? So it's really, it's not that different in some ways. It's a very different theater, but not that different than the question that we asked in Europe during the Cold War, which was, could the Soviets push through, could the Warsaw Pact push through the Fulda Gap fast enough that it would prevent follow-on forces from the United States from actually being able to get there and reinforce the French and the Germans and the Brits in particular. In East Asia, the problem is going to be, can American carriers get there fast enough, especially if one or two are disabled right at the beginning of a conflict, right? And if, say, Guam and Okinawa, the air bases there, are taken down in the opening couple hours of conflict, can the US actually fight back through fast enough to prevent Taiwan from being strangled? And I think you're going to hear different answers from people that have done different war games. Much of this comes down to the amount of classified detail that has been included in the war games. So you'll hear lots of different positions. I think the bottom line is no one really knows exactly what would happen. That means the Chinese also don't know, and they can't be incredibly confident that they would succeed. So that's the good news. The bad news is that Xi Jinping has shown that sometimes he's willing to take some risks. And so it's not enough for us just to say, well, they might not be able to do it. We have to be able to show them, and I would say without using nuclear weapons, that with conventional forces, the US and its allies and partners could rebuff an attack of that sort. If we can do that, then I think we'll have a stable deterrence. If we can't do that, then I think we're at some risk. And I think at the moment, it's a 50-50 proposition and probably getting worse every day. So my hope is that the Biden team will come in and really put a lot of thought and effort into this problem. I'm biased, as I said, to thinking that they will. The incoming Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kathleen Hicks, is someone I worked for at the Pentagon and worked for a number of years at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She's thought a lot about this problem, as have a whole bunch of other officials that have just come on board in the Defense Department. I think they'll get their hands around it, but it's a really tough problem. And as I said, we're going to need our allies involved if we're going to be able to solve it.
Very good. I'm still searching for someone who's going to give us some good news. I'm an optimistic pessimist, Zack. So it's definitely, I think, as you say, it's a line ball at the moment, 50-50 on sort of what does actually happen, and hence why it's a critical issue, particularly here for us, also in Australia. Look, given the time, we've had you for 50 minutes. Really do appreciate your evening there from Washington. Zack Cooper, Senior Fellow with the American Enterprise Institute. Zack, we'll have some links to those articles and also to your Twitter feed in the show notes. So to our audience, thank you for those who left messages, at least confirming that the stream worked. So someone was watching. Zack, that's the main thing. And I don't think we'll need to edit this particular episode. So I understand you've got another interview to go to. Zack, thank you so much for your time. And we'll let you go. And we'll stay in touch for sure. I'd love to have you back on.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Great discussion. And really appreciate you having me on.
Absolute pleasure. And in fact, maybe when your book is out, we'll do a book review.
Yes, that would be great.
Good man. Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Cheers. Okay, that was very, very interesting, and I'll have to sort of watch that again in terms of the types of subjects we covered. But I think we'll definitely keep this series going and sort of an ongoing discussion. I've got a couple of people in mind that we'll have on as well on sort of the developments of this, and it does change week to week. The Tech and Sec Weekly report of the day is the New South Wales Cybersecurity Standards Harmonisation Task Force. I mentioned we're going to have Jed Horner on from Standards Australia on next Friday. So we will discuss the task force and these key recommendations. The top three, I understand there's a bit of an issue downloading it off the marketplace at the moment, but otherwise go to Standards Australia and that will be there, or the Australian Cybersecurity Magazine will have the link on that too. But some of the key outcomes: new practical guidance material across all sectors is needed. This is obviously in a state New South Wales cybersecurity context. Revision of certain existing standards is warranted, and considered use of standards in policy and regulatory responses is important. We are yet to sort of go into greater detail, but we will next week with Jed, and I'll have a proper read before as well. But definitely an important document here in Australia in terms of cybersecurity and standards harmonisation. So that's it from us. Thank you so much for joining us on our Friday episode. We'll be back on Tuesday afternoon at 3 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time with the University of Sydney looking at semiconductors for something different. So thank you so much.